Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Outward is an open world action RPG that came out in 2019. If you're an OG subscriber, you probably know that I covered this game extensively with tips, guides and various videos. Then we had a couple of big DLCs for the game, which I also covered on the channel. The Soroborians DLC was the first one and it added a lot of new features like new character classes, enchanting system and a brand new zone. The Three Brothers DLC also added a lot of new content as well. And now we're getting a definitive edition, which contains all the previous DLCs and some major changes to the gameplay in general, which I'll try to cover in this video. The definitive edition is coming out on May 17th on PC and consoles, and if you already have the previous DLC called The Three Brothers, you can get the definitive edition for free. This is a sponsored video by the way, even though I would cover the new content regardless, since that's something I always do for Outward. So let's get straight to it. Like I said, we're going to cover some major changes to the gameplay in this definitive edition, but let's take a moment to talk about the game in general. Outward is an open world action RPG with some survival mechanics. It doesn't exactly play like a traditional storytelling RPG, even though it does have quests of course, which push the story forward.
You can't just shrug off that responsibility.
However, the biggest focus of the game is definitely the exploration and choosing how to build your character. The game offers you a lot of different ways to do so, with a ton of loot you're going to find and 12 different skill trees. You're going to explore 6 different locations and you can do it alone or in co-op. The co-op works in online mode as well as the local split screen mode, which is always great to see. So that will be a quick summary of the game. Now let's talk about those major changes. The progression system in Outward was always one of the main appeals, at least for me. The game doesn't have any sort of levels or leveling, which was kinda weird at first. But after you played it for a while and get the hang of the gameplay mechanics, that sense of progression quickly kicks in. It's basically all about the balance between the skills you're going to get and the equipment you plan to use. Outward has a ton of unique armor sets and weapons that you're going to find or craft, which is easily one of my most favorite things about the game. The definitive edition has one major change when it comes to the difficulty curve and progression. It's mostly related to protection stats that you'll find on all armor pieces in the game. Protection is the stat that reduces physical damage taken by a flat amount. Heavy armor pieces usually have a lot of protection, but the drawback for wearing those kinds of armors is reduced character speed and higher stamina costs. In the definitive edition, the protection now not only applies to physical damage, but impact as well. Impact is another important stat in the game, which is related to stability bar. The stability is basically the stat which prevents you or the NPC from being staggered and open for some free damage. When blocking with a shield or a weapon, the stability points are much higher, which makes you or the NPC harder to stagger. To put it simply, the protection stat is now a lot more useful because it makes your character harder to stagger. Developers wanted to incentivize the players to use heavier armor more than before. I think this change was based on player feedback. But like I said, this applies to enemies as well, which makes most fights harder than before. In order to prevent enemies from being impossible to stagger, they also made some changes to impact resistance stat as well. I highly recommend watching this older video where I explained all the stats in Outward. It should give you a good idea how all the stats in the game affect your character. Aside from increasing the protection, they also buffed some NPCs with more health and resistances. Another big change in the definitive edition is how the content from previous DLCs is applied to the whole game. For example, one of the major features of the Soroborians DLC was enchanting. You need to follow a step-by-step process to make enchantments, and of course I have a video about that as well. The recipes and the majority of materials you needed for this activity could only be found in the new DLC zone. But now you can buy these recipes from various stores in all regions. Same goes for the musical totems which were introduced in the second DLC, The Three Brothers. The Ritualist was the newest class in the game based around musical totems, and now you can find the items he needs in various regions. What's possibly the biggest change when it comes to DLC content distribution is the corruption. The Soroborians DLC introduced the corruption feature. These hazardous areas were only found in the new DLC zone, but now you'll encounter them in every region where it makes sense. Corruption can leave lasting negative effects on your character, so without the proper gear and items to mitigate the effects, it can be quite dangerous. The last change when it comes to DLC content distribution are the item properties. You'll be able to find gear with various item properties in all areas. For example, the barrier and cooldown reduction can now be found on items in vanilla regions of the game. It's a subtle change, but it's definitely useful when building your character. Speaking of subtle changes, the Three Brothers DLC town management feature also got one. The rare materials drop chance can be really low, so to counter this, now you can talk with a town NPC to trade 3 of any samples for the specific type of rare resource you are looking for. The last notable change is the town reset feature. The way it works is pretty simple. If you spend 7 in-game days outside of a major city, it will reset. But what does that mean exactly? Well, I'm glad you asked. For example, the lootable containers will reset after 7 days, so you can loot them again. These containers have randomly generated loot, so you can always find some useful materials. The idea is to give you something useful to do if you're playing in co-op, while your friend is learning new skills or reorganizing his inventory. The town reset feature will also remove everything that you dropped on the floor. So for example, if you placed a tent in the city, it will disappear after 7 days if you don't pick it up. I think this goes the same for every item. It's not a huge deal, but it's something that you should be aware about. All of these changes that I mentioned should be quite apparent when you start a new playthrough. So yeah, the Definitive Edition is a good excuse to come back to the game and try out a new build. Like I said before, I think that's one of the biggest strengths of the game. Speaking about the biggest strengths, the split-screen co-op feature is a big deal, especially in an RPG. I remember talking about co-op in RPGs when Outward came out and how great it would be if other RPG developers consider this game mode. Even though I personally prefer playing in single-player modes, I know a lot of people love the co-op feature. Not to mention the long-forgotten split-screen feature on PC that I thought we're never going to see again in RPGs, on PC at least. So yeah, the Anniversary Edition is a good excuse to come back to the game or to try it out for the first time alone or with a friend. If you do so, make sure to check out my old tips and guides for the game, which should help you out. Anyway guys, that would be it for this video. The Definitive Edition is coming out on May 17th, which should be the day this video goes live, so if you're watching this, it's probably already available. Like I said, if you already have the latest DLC called The Three Brothers, you can claim the Definitive Edition for free. I will leave the full playlist for all my Outward videos, so you can check that out by clicking on the card in the corner. Don't forget to subscribe for more RPG content. If you want to support the channel in the long run, consider becoming a Patreon or a YouTube member. You can get your name on the end credits, as well as some other perks like early access to videos, Discord roles, my plans for future content, etc. etc. That will be all, and I'll see you in the next one.